amount of scientific studies of something can tell you whether or not something is a fundamental human right. No amount of scientific studies can tell you whether or not an agency has the authority to do something that might be suggested as a good thing to do. Just because it's a good thing to do doesn't mean that agency has the authority to do it. I am back. It's good to be back. Oh, goodness. And I saw this one pop up over my vacation, and I knew I'd be talking about it when I got back because I'm reminded again that nature forgets, quite frankly, the role of science versus the role of the Supreme Court. There's also something else that they forgot in here when this piece was written. And I think it bears in mind to point out, because it changes quite well, the context of the particular issue here being discussed. And I gotta say, this was actually a pretty poorly written article, because you'd think it's about the Supreme Court being anti-science, when it's really not. It's honestly just nature bitching, for lack of a better way to describe it. I'm sorry to have to say it that way. But it's really disappointing to see from nature. And again, this is why I don't think very highly of nature anymore. And I personally have no intention of ever publishing there. It's really just utterly despicable. So I do want to go through this and discuss a few of the items in it. I'm not going to hit through all of it because there's no need to here. But I do want to make a point that there's very little of this that's actually about science. But there's also one critical, out of context quote that is utterly ignored by the author here, which I think is actually pretty crucial oversight. And I imagine the legal folks, the folks who are more savvy in law than I am, would have a point to make about it, given that nature forgot this, quite frankly. So, in late June, the United States Supreme Court issued a trio of landmark decisions that repealed the right to abortion, loosened gun restrictions, and curtailed climate regulations. That's not entirely accurate to what they did. They basically said the EPA can't do what it was doing without asking Congress for the authority. That's different. That's a little bit different than just curtailing climate regulations and saying you can't regulate climate at all. It's about how you go about it. Although the decisions differed in rationale, they share a distinct trait. All three dismissed substantial evidence about how the court's rulings would affect public health and safety. It is a troubling trend that many scientists fear could undermine the role of scientific evidence in shaping public policy. Now, as the court prepares to consider a landmark case on electoral policies, many worry about the future of democracy itself. Now, here's a point that I want to make in all this, is that nature continues to forget. For all the thing about evidence and science shaping public policy, which I actually agree. Scientific knowledge should aid decision making. But notice I say aid. It shouldn't be the all guiding thing. And I do fear that what nature and others are pushing for is not scientific knowledge aiding decision making, but it is scientific expertise being all powerful in decision making, meaning scientism. Scientism is the irrational notion that science can solve every dilemma, which it cannot. Cannot solve moral dilemmas because science's goal is the pursuit of the truth. But they forget that very much, that a scientist's primary purpose is the pursuit of the truth. At least in my view it is. And they also forget the role of the Supreme Court. The court is co-equal to both other branches of government. It is not subservient to any other branch of government. It is co-equal. It is the court's primary job, when it is looking at something, to say, does this go in violation of the Constitution? There is nothing about that very simple purpose that requires that has a whole heck of a lot to do with the scientific pursuit of the truth and the understanding of the physical and social world, excuse me, and the like. Why do I say that? Because science can tell you X and Y, Z about anything, really, in theory. If you set up an experiment, you could figure out XYZ thing about just about anything within reason. There's certain things I think particularly that are at the current juncture impossible to figure out. But the idea, like science can't tell you about some of the moral related questions about why certain people do the things that they do, necessarily. But if you're talking about stuff with climate or what have you, or stuff with geology or stuff with meteorology or any number of the physical and social sciences, yes, you can talk about, science can say X about X thing and what the relationship between these things are and all this other kind of stuff. What the scientists cannot say, because it is not their jurisdiction, it is not their purpose, it is not their purview, it cannot say whether or not something is a human right. That is the job of the court when interpreting the Constitution, to say whether or not something is a human right. That particular aspect doesn't require scientific evidence to do. You can do that without scientific evidence to say whether or not something is a right. You can also see all the evidence in therein, and then, okay, why is this a right? Why is this a human right? Meaning you have it by nature, by virtue of being born. You have the right to do this. Or if you take it from the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which many things are based, you have it by virtue of being created by God. You can take it in either interpretation, it would end up in about the same place. Or at least I think it would end up about the same place. Again, legal scholars, this would be your purview to weigh in more so than mine. I'm more so making the comment that nature, again, forgets the purpose of science, because it should aid in shaping public policy, but it should not be something that forces all public policy in a particular direction or another. Why? Because you have to determine, is this going to infringe on somebody else's rights if we do this? That isn't a question of science. You have to determine, is this a right at all in the first place, this particular thing? That's not a question of science. You have to determine whether or not said federal agency has the authority under the Constitution to do that. That's not a question of science. None of that is questions of science. That is questions of law, and constitutional law in particular. Doesn't matter how much scientific evidence you throw at something to say, these kinds of regulations will do this, these kinds of regulations will do that, what have you. You can throw all those regulations in there, but it is still a question of whether or not the agency you would be asking to implement those regulations has the authority under the Constitution to do that. And that goes back that is a very different question than the scientific ones about the physical world and whether or not these regulations would have an impact and all that kind of jazz. That's a very, very, very different question. But nature, unfortunately, utterly forgets that in writing pieces like these. And this is probably the third or fourth piece I've seen from them with this. And it's unfortunately very, very unfortunate, really, because it's just like pieces like this are why I have absolutely no respect for nature anymore, to be honest. Often regarded as the most powerful court in the free world, the Supreme Court sits in judgment of laws enacted by Congress and state legislatures, as well as constitutional disputes at any level of government. And don't forget, it's also in judgment of whether or not agencies have the authority to do something or whether or not Congress granted them that authority. You were forgetting. Its unusual power in comparison to high courts and other democracies derives in part from its small size and the fact that its justices are appointed for life. This makes appointments both highly consequential and highly political. Partisan divisions in the U.S. government make passing new laws difficult and adopting constitutional amendments next to impossible, meeting the court's word on crucial issues such as the right to an abortion. It is not a right. I'm sorry, that's basically what the court found, is it's not a right. Can stand as the law of the land for a generation or more. Wrong again. The court doesn't make law. It interprets the law. Let's see. Scientific evidence has played into some high-profile issues put before the court. In 2007, for instance, the Supreme Court set the stage for modern climate regulations when it ruled that carbon dioxide, and by extension other greenhouse gases, qualify as pollutants under the Clean Air Act. And research on brain development in adolescents directly informed a series of rulings on appropriate sentencing for young people convicted of violent crimes. Roper versus Simmons in 2005, for example, found that it was cruel to impose the death penalty on individuals who were under the age of 18 that the crime was committed. Several cases over the next decade limited the application of life sentences without parole for juveniles. But as the court swung to the ideological right, its attitude toward science also shifted. For neuroscientists involved in juvenile sentencing, the tide turned in 2021. Reversing the trend in earlier decisions, the Supreme Court allowed a Mississippi court to sentence Brett Jones to life in prison without conducting mental evaluation looking at his capacity for change. Jones was convicted of killing his grandfather when he was 15 years old. There's no way to argue that this decision was enlightened by science. They clearly ignored it. That's a mindset and a reason to worry. You notice something interesting with that? They're taking one thing. It's one anecdotal thing here, for that matter. Anyway, continuing. This is actually what I really wanted to get to right here. The prevailing theory among the Supreme Court's current majority is known as originalism. Adherents of the theory claim to seek interpretations of the U.S. Constitution as it would have been understood when it was adopted or amended. Some historians, however, have accused the current court of cherry-picking the past to craft narratives that are incomplete, inconsistent, and at times just plain wrong. In its decision overturning overturning Roe v. Wade in June, for instance, the court found that abortion, quote, is not, quote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Writing for the majority, that should be capitalized because that is his title. Somebody who is an editor at Nature should really be on their game with this. That is his title. You should be capitalizing it. Whether you like it or not is irrelevant. Justice Samuel Alito noted that the idea the Constitution guarantees a woman's right to abortion did not exist before the late 20th century, and that abortion was illegal in every state before the court's landmark Roe v. Wade decision conferred that right in 1973. That assessment ignores more than a century of the nation's early history when abortion in the first 3 or 4 months of pregnancy was tolerated. The American Historical Association in Washington, D.C., and the Organization of American Historians in Bloomington, Indiana, laid out this early history in a court briefing before the ruling. The briefing slammed the Supreme Court for dismissing this reality and instead adopting a flawed interpretation of abortion criminalization that has been pressed by anti-abortion advocates for more than 30 years. In doing so, the court also dismissed decades of research indicating that its decision would negatively affect a woman's health and increase long-standing disparities in the health system. Quote, the court's willingness to issue opinions that are likely to have discernible adverse impacts on the population is astonishing, and says Parmet, and quite at odds with the long tradition of how courts have dealt with issues of public health. Okay, 2 things I want to point out with this. Let us say for a moment, let me make a point. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito notes the idea the Constitution. Should also be capitalized. For crying out loud, it's the United States Constitution. I know Nature's based in the UK, but capitalize it, please. Guarantees a woman's right to abortion did not exist before the late 20th century, and that abortion was illegal in every state. What is he saying? He's saying the right to abortion did not exist in the late 20th century, and that abortion was illegal in every state before the court's landmark ruling. Now, he's noting that the idea here in particular did not exist before the 20th century. This thing here is about the early history of abortions being performed. Do you notice that those are two different things? Sure, you might have had abortions going on and being performed. What Justice Alito was saying is different. He's saying that the idea that the Constitution guaranteed a right to abortion did not exist before the 20th century. Those are two very different things. Those are two very different things. This is not great argument on the part of nature, I gotta say. But there's also one other thing I want to know. The folks who've read the ruling, which I did actually read a fair chunk of the opinion, from Dobbs v. Jackson, out of my curiosity. In its decision overturning the right to abortion in June, for instance, the court found that abortion is not, quote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. That is out of context. I can tell you that much. That is out of context. And I have it here right for you. In this particular paragraph of Dobbs v. Jackson, here, pull it over a little bit for you. Next, the court examines whether the right to obtain an abortion is rooted in the nation's history and tradition and whether it is an essential component of ordered liberty. The court finds that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. The underlying theory on which Casey rested, that the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause provides substantive as well as procedural protections for liberty, has long been controversial. The court's decisions have held that the Due Process Clause protects two categories of substantive rights: those rights guaranteed by the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, and those rights deemed fundamental that are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. In deciding whether a right falls into either of these categories, the question is whether the right is, quote, deeply rooted in our history and tradition, and whether it is essential to this nation's, quote, scheme of ordered liberty. Timms versus Indiana. The term liberty alone provides little guidance. So here's the thing. There are two things he's actually talking about in this, not just one. Not just the history part of it is in here, but that's all that nature mentioned. The question is whether or not it belongs in ordered liberty. And that is a fair question. I would open that up. Being that I am not a legal person myself and I am not interested in necessarily getting into the legalese too much with it, I just had to point out that nature completely ignored that particular sentence, that particular component, not to mention the fact that that whole section is not just on the nation's history and tradition, but also on the concept of ordered liberty. And just doing some due diligence here, allow me to share with you the idea of ordered liberty from the Everman. It is not less true, because it is a truism, to assert that politics is downstream of culture insofar as it is understood in the widest sense, i.e. how people live together in society. The founders created a constitution as a framework for people living under a system of ordered liberty. A constitution that was, as John Adams wrote in 1798 in a letter to the Massachusetts militia, quote, made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Thus, a republic of ordered liberty presumes a moral people. In the case of America, our morality is derived from fundamental Judeo-Christian values and natural law tradition, in which every citizen has inherent rights conferred by God, nature, or reason. The tenets upon which our republic is based was articulated even before Adams' letter in 1788 by James Madison in a speech before the Virginia Ratifying Convention, when he stated that, quote, to suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. This is why, in our constitutional republic, examining the role of the federal government regarding certain issues is not just religious or moral in nature. Issues such as promoting abortion, propagating values throughout academia down to grade school, fomenting hatred, or any other kinds of things, is that kind of thing. So this simply the point to make here, the simple way of defining it is you have a certain amount of freedom that is given. Hold on a second. Certain amount of freedom that is given here. And basically it is freedom that is limited by the need for order in society. You can't have freedoms to do absolutely everything, because then that would be chaos and you would trounce on the rights of others. Hence the idea of ordered liberty here. And so whether or not the idea of abortion falls within the premise of ordered liberty is a question to be asked. you just can't have utter chaos. But that is a key point in this Nature article that was utterly ignored, and that's why I wanted to mention it. Let's see. Those are the main things that I actually wanted to hit in here, so I don't want to go through absolutely all of this. But my kind of key point with this is that there's actually very little in here that says the Supreme Court is actually making a war on science, as much as the authors are just kind of unhappy about the decisions, the decisions the court made. But I'll say it again, science is a discipline in pursuit of the truth, and I do think it should be aiding public policy, aiding the shaping of public policy, not fully driving it completely, no, but aiding it for sure. The problem is the idea of scientism, where you have it be just used to make every single decision. And that is an utterly bad one. And I think that's more of what they're arguing here, is that scientific things should be used for absolutely every decision, but no amount of scientific studies of something can tell you whether or not something is a fundamental human right. No amount of scientific studies can tell you whether or not an agency has the authority to do something that might be suggested as a good thing to do. Just because it's a good thing to do doesn't mean that agency has the authority to do it. That is the purpose of the court. It is very much to restrain the power of the federal government, at least in part of its role. It's also to make sure that the state governments don't overstep their bounds, because its role is interpreting the law with regard to the Constitution in here, and whether or not such things are in line with the Constitution. So if it's explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, well, you really can't. The federal government is not technically allowed to infringe on those things that are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. And that is what the court oversees. Therein lies the wrinkle. Nature forgets, and I think it's quite possible, I've seen it in Scientific American and Science also, all of them have forgotten that it's not the role of science to determine what's a right. It's not the role of science to determine whether or not an agency has the authority to do something. That's the role of the Supreme Court. And you can hate the decision, you can love the decision. But you better also recognize the differences in roles between science and the Supreme Court. That's it. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.